share my screen so I can show some slides. I think you have to give me permission, Amy.
Oh yeah.
Disabled.
Yes. Screen. Okay, see if that works now.
Perfect. Okay, is that showing up for you guys?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, so as I said, I just sort of went through some of the research that's been done on this topic. People have been really quick to kind of study this and publish it, remarkably. So there was some research done kind of in the spring and in the summer, just looking at like what is going on with teens in terms of actual social distancing, and then how is that impacting their mental health. So I pulled some of that just so we could kind of get some numbers to back up, you know, what we're already experiencing and what I'm sure you all are experiencing in your work with kids and adolescents. But feel free to stop me as we're talking. You know, I'd rather just have a conversation with you all than me sort of run through this. And then again, I'm happy just to talk through like whatever's helpful for you guys. So I think, at least Amy, you know this from talking with me a little bit. I mean, teens are sort of my background and my focus area. Certainly younger kids I've got some experience with as well, and that kind of early adult, you know, 20-year-old-ish population. So I like talking about this stuff. Hopefully it's helpful to you guys. But basically, there's some research just looking at, you know, how much teens said they were social distancing and why they were doing it. And this was done back in March, like right after it was declared a national emergency and right after COVID was declared to be a pandemic. So I guess the good news is that about 98% of teens said they were social distancing. And you can see kind of the numbers that said they were doing it a lot or a great deal. So pretty good compliance with the requirements to social distance that were obviously very strict in a lot of states back in March. And what they did is they basically asked teens why they were social distancing. You can kind of see the numbers here. The most common reasons that teens said they were social distancing were pretty much to care for others. So social responsibility and keeping others from getting sick. And then what they called control reasons, which was basically the law says I have to or my parents say I have to. So things like lockdown and then parents' rules. And teens who said that they social distance for those reasons tended to do more social distancing. So some good news in terms of teens looking out for other people and complying with sort of all the legal stuff that was put in place. And then much smaller numbers of teens saying things like, I don't want to get myself sick, although that was still pretty high. There were some teens who basically said I would rather stay home anyway. And they were actually the ones that were doing the best in terms of mental health. Sorry, my screen keeps slipping. And then, you know, some sort of social reasons. So my friends said I should, avoiding judgment, that sort of thing. So then what they did was they kind of looked at how that impacted mental health. And basically the amount that teens said that they were social distancing wasn't what mattered. It was more about the reasons that they said they were social distancing. So again, the teens that were social distancing for other people's sake tended to, I guess, unfortunately not do that well in some regards. If they were, well, they didn't actually have a link between doing it for other people's benefit. They didn't see any impact with mental health there. So trying to keep other people from getting sick or its social responsibility. What they saw is that when teens wanted to keep themselves from getting sick, they were more anxious, but they felt like less of a burden. So maybe like parents didn't really have to keep tabs on them the same way. If they said it was for sort of social reasons, like avoiding judgment, or their friends told them to, it wasn't so great. We saw more anxiety, more depression. So potentially sort of that sense of being negatively evaluated by their peers. And then if their parents' rules said they had to do it, they had this kind of greater sense of belonging. So the thinking there was that maybe they sort of felt cared for by parents who were like looking out for them. And then again, the teens that said, well, we would have just stayed home anyway, they tended to have lower anxiety and depression, which, you know, we could talk about what's going on with those teens and why they don't want to be out socializing. We know that's a lot of Gen Z teens anyway, but yeah, they were kind of less impacted by social distancing. So kind of interesting there. So that was that piece of it. And then looking just a little bit at kind of what we know about isolation and loneliness. I mean, we hear in the news all the time about loneliness and how that's growing. Like the UK has like a minister for loneliness, right? Because it's considered to be this like epidemic. And we know it's bad for us. It's linked to depression, it's linked to anxiety. And there's some evidence that it's actually the duration of our loneliness as opposed to how intense it is that seems to matter for our mental health. So if we think about COVID now, like 6+ months of isolation, it's not good for us. So that's all kind of the bad news. There is some hopefully good news mixed into all of this, but kind of just looking a little bit more at some numbers first. So back in June, they did some research like nationwide where they interviewed parents of children and teens, and about a quarter of parents were saying that their own mental health had gotten worse during COVID, and then about 14% said that their children's like behavioral mental health was getting worse, particularly for younger kids. And then we had about 10% of families where they're saying that the parents and the kids were struggling more. So if we think about that, you know, kids are impacted by their parents' mental health and their parents' well-being, and so we're seeing a significant number of families where everybody's kind of struggling, and we can speculate like how that would compound when parents and kids are doing worse. And in this study, they looked at all the kind of stuff that we know is happening because of COVID. So things like losing childcare, losing, you know, financial stress, all that kind of stuff that is just weighing on people more and more as this continues. Excuse me. So some of the last data I want to show you is just looking a little bit more specifically at what teens are thinking about with COVID and how they're spending their time and how their mental health is being impacted. So this was done in Canada, but I think what we're seeing here is probably pretty true with teens in the US as well. So this table down here is just showing like what percentages of teens said they were worried about these different things related to COVID. So looking at teens who said they were like a little or somewhat worried or very much worried, we see just these really high numbers of teens who are worried about their school year being impacted, their finances, they're worrying about their family's financial situation. They're worried about social stuff, so their reputation, staying connected to friends. 43% are saying they're really worried about COVID, and 54% are saying they're like somewhat worried about COVID. They're worried about getting sick, other people getting sick, you know, getting really ill if they're infected. So there's a lot of anxiety for teens right now, not surprisingly. And then what we're seeing is that when they're stressed about COVID, they're experiencing more loneliness, more depression. Not surprisingly, teens are using social media far more than they ever were before. So about half, once school shut down, were using it for over 5 hours a day. That's like independent of any other screen time that they're doing. Yeah, so then we see more depression, more loneliness tied to that, or more depression specifically. The good news is that when teens were spending more time with their family, they had less loneliness and less depression. So we know that that's helpful for them to get that family support. And with friends, what was interesting was we saw that when they had that virtual contact, they had less loneliness, but more depression. So, you know, we know social contact is good, social support is good, but we kind of want to be thinking about what teens are doing when they're talking to their friends, and are they sort of ruminating together and dwelling on things, and you know, and when they're on social media, what are they doing? Are they looking at news that they don't really know how to make sense of, or that's just scaring them? So kind of just, you know, I think the take-home message here is social contact, social support is good, but we want parents and people who work with teens to be monitoring what they're doing and be thinking about what's helpful and what's not in terms of that contact and that technology use. So I wanted to just kind of go over a few things that you guys probably are familiar with. I don't think any of this is, you know, super news to anybody, but just thinking a little bit about things to look for with teens that can be signs that they're struggling. So things like sadness, of course, withdrawal if they don't want to hang out with friends, or withdrawing from families. With teens and young people in particular, depression can show up looking a lot like irritability, being crabby, having a bad temper. Same thing with anxiety, that irritability can pop up. Teens who don't really want to do things anymore. They don't want to like engage in their hobbies. You know, they're just kind of losing interest in things. Obviously, substance use is a concern, and there is some indication of like more frequent drinking and marijuana use among teens with the pandemic. And then things like sleep difficulties, trouble focusing, trouble in school. And again, for teens and young people, we tend to see some of the mental health stuff and stress show up as physical symptoms. So headaches, stomach aches, right? I mean, we get that as adults too, but definitely kids and teens. Yeah. And I see you guys nodding. That's not news to anybody, right? It shows up with our stress.
Yeah, we have some chronic headache stuff on our staff for sure, and then like all of this stuff. Our kids have like talked about a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's true, right? Especially when we don't really have words for something. And again, like with young people and in particular cultures, all of this kind of mental health stuff shows up in our bodies. And we know that there's that mind-body connection. And my stomach hurts and my head hurts and my muscles are sore. Oh, I'm stressed, right? Oh, I'm nervous, I'm sad. So yeah, absolutely. So the last thing I wanted to just think about, and I'd be curious to hear kind of what you guys are all experiencing as well with working with teens, but thinking about just strategies for supporting them. Some of it is really basic, boring stuff. Amy, I know you shared with me hearing so much from the young people you all work with about them kind of losing that routine where they're just like, their days and nights are all out of sync, and it's like, when am I supposed to be in school? When am I supposed to do this? Routines are really, really good for us, and they're really hard when we don't have, in-person school, or we don't have our extracurriculars that we used to have. So routines around like eating, sleep, exercise, easier said than done. But the more that young people can do that, I think the better off they are, just in terms of kind of regulating their bodies and their minds. Getting good sleep is obviously really important. Social connections in whatever form teens can get them are obviously good. And then I think as adults working with teens, whether we're parents or, teachers or whatever capacity we're working with them, and doing that validation and that understanding of, yes, this is hard and this is frustrating and you're losing out on things and you're disappointed, right? Like kind of just recognizing that reality and figuring out how do you accept it and move forward is really important as well. So that's what I have for you guys, but I'm happy again to just kind of have a conversation or hear what you guys are experiencing with the people you work with.
Thanks, Anne.
Yeah.
Do you mind going back to some of the early statistic screens? There are a couple of things that I'm finding really interesting. This one thing that really stands out to me is how this part about parents' rules, and when parents applied rules about you can't go out, like you have to social distance because we say so, that there's a stronger sense of belonging, better mental health. That's thrilling to me. I don't know that I would have expected that.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting as well. So the theory behind some of this was, before they did the study, kind of coming from the idea that when we do things of our own accord, it tends to make us act more in pro-social ways, like doing things for other people, versus when someone tells us to do something, right? And that's not surprising. And again, what the authors were kind of speculating here was that maybe teens just feel sort of cared for by their parents. If it's like, hey, this is really important, this is to keep you safe, right? I mean, I don't know. It seems like a little bit of a nicer story than what I imagine many teens kind of feel when their parents are enforcing some of this stuff. But I suppose given the number of teens that said they wanted to do this, for other people, maybe there is some sense of just kind of feeling like, hey, we're all in this together, or my parents care about me and this is beneficial right now. I don't know.
That one really stood out to me too, the sense of belonging, because we're talking about it so much in the diversity, equity, and inclusion, mode as well. And how important belonging is, and so at Wordplay, we're adding that as a fourth, our board was really wanting to bring that in as a fourth DEIB. And so that's something I'd be curious just to explore in a bigger context, even, is teens and belonging. And being a parent myself, tying that back to like rules, and then thinking about like community rules, like what can we do at Wordplay too? We set kind of a working norms among our staff, and in our groups right now, with it being online, it's not as easy to kick off with a little exercise on how do we want to engage with each other, how do we want to show up, how are we here for each other. But maybe that's something we should look at for our next semester.
I think that would be awesome. And there is one of the questions that we ask in our survey is about like social connection, and it'd be, I think, simple to like drop it a layer deeper into belonging. And a lot of our teachers naturally cultivate that when they're encouraging the students to interact. They'll say like, you know, how do you best prefer feedback, and like, what do you most need today? What's your two of our teachers particularly basically do mental health check-ins each week at the beginning of class, like from down here to up here, like how's your mental health? And it's yeah, that's been interesting. I've been taking note of that as a way of measurement too, just this like kind of informal stuff that's happening that's like giving us a little more information about how students are doing. And I also have this curiosity about, like, I don't know if anyone's done any work about this or not, but like the social rules that have emerged, including like when you keep your camera on and off. And I'm noticing patterns around that with our young people and around connection. And so, yeah, that's kind of starting to pique my curiosity too. Like, I feel safer if I have my screen off, but then also I'm not necessarily connecting very deeply or like super engaged.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting.
What about, can we take a look at your recommendations again and maybe have some conversation about that?
Yeah, I mean, again, these are super general, super brief, but yeah, I'd love to talk more about this and hear what you guys think about these.
Cool. It strikes me that wordplay is particularly well poised to talk about social connection, stress management, and like routine. I think we would probably talk about as like art making, repetitive art making, or ritual almost. Actually, all of these I think could fit into our programming, but social connection comes up first, and then maybe teaching more overt stress management techniques might make sense for us too.
Well, and I even think just, you know, there's literature that shows us that writing about emotional experiences is helpful, right? And so that, you know, I think even talking with teens about like, hey, here's an opportunity for you to do this, you know, or kind of thinking about how that fits into some of the programming that you're doing, or even just saying, hey, here's a space to be creative. That's a way to deal with your stress. Like, so much of what you guys are doing is inherently tied into these ideas of social connectedness and dealing with stress, which I think is great. But I like the idea of what you're saying about routine too, Amy. And maybe it's like, you know, just even like having wordplay, right? Like having a program that they go to at a certain time, that's a routine, and that's that structure.
It helps. Like, we saw that a lot with Spring's classes this summer, with Spring work with Aiken students through the whole summer, and having those check-ins with their teacher who did them more often than wordplay, but especially every time Spring would come, students would show up. They appreciated the routine, and also the built-in like Spring, how you structured a sense of coherence, like a beginning, middle, end kind of situation with each of those. It's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that consistency is great, right? Even within the programming each week. So yeah.
Social connection is tricky. It's trickier in this landscape. I'm wondering about some best practices research, particular to engagement strategies for a social connection, maybe specifically toward mental health building. That might be something that would be really useful for our teaching artists.
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of dig more into that. I don't know, like, you know, how much people have looked at that in terms of a virtual context. I know, you know, like with us, with teaching, I mean, we are talking a lot, like at Xavier, about how do you create that connection when you have some people in person and some people remote, or in some cases entirely remote, like what you all are doing. you know, so whether it's kind of giving students, I mean, and I know with your programming, you know, thinking about things like students having that chance just to share with each other, if they can kind of get paired up, right? Some of those opportunities to create that sense of community and connection, even across the screen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, I'll see if I can find anything else, and I'll pass that on to you if I do.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah. So, I mean, it's so early in this experience. I'm sure there's not a ton of best practice research. There's some things that are coming out more conversationally. I think we've been, the three of us have been engaging in like collaborative partner conversations ever since March, just on like, okay, what's working for you? Here's what's working for us. Those have been super useful. And I wonder, like, probably I imagine in the next like 2 or 3 months, we'll start to get some more like quantitative data about what's happening. It just takes time for everyone to catch up to something like this.
Right. I think that, you know, the maybe helpful thing that we can look to, though, is there is plenty of research on online courses, at least in the college setting. And, you know, I mean, certainly there are high schools that are online anyway. So I wonder if people have looked at that. But at least if we go up a little bit developmentally, there's plenty of stuff on best practices in online college courses.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I haven't done any research about online best practices in the collegiate sphere.
Yeah, I'll go back to some of that and I'll share with you what I find, because I did a little bit of looking into that, like getting ready for this semester, but I know it's out there because people are talking about it.
Ah, cool. That's great. That'd be especially useful for our program.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
I keep thinking too, like, what can we do? It's going to take more time and effort and money too, but are there ways outside of screen time that we can still connect with our kids? You know, like letter writing, you know, can we generate something that would be a physical, tangible response and still build connection? You know, we talked about earlier, you know, could we do a little like parade through some streets in Northside with our school or something, you know, kind of like the former car honking, you know, parades that they were doing, teachers for their kids and all. But yeah, you know, delivering books to kids' houses, that's happened some. And we talked about delivering like creative kits to kids' houses also, and just for a quick wave, you know, from the sidewalk and all. But again, it's pretty time intensive, but yeah, my brain just keeps going there just to maintain some connection. You know, it feels to me, and I'm not even the one in the programs, but just more and more tenuous to kind of keep that depth as the year goes on. I can only imagine what teachers are feeling, you know, and yeah, so just thinking out loud.
And I wonder too about things like, even if you like mailed postcards to some of your students, you know, it's like something of like, hey, I can hold this in my hand or look at it, and somebody was thinking about me, and I don't have to look at a screen.
Yeah, yeah, and that would be cool. Maybe that's something we can generate.
We have one of our volunteers just offered along these lines to put together book making kits for us to send out to the students, to mail to students, which I think might be really fun, with instructions and then some writing prompts. And then the Harriet Beecher Stowe House has like a huge yard, and last week they offered if we want to do any distance things at any time, we can like just show up and use their outdoor space, which is in Walnut Hill. So things like that, I think we're starting to like. And the wheat paste, we're gonna do in this like protest art wheat pasting extravaganza would be a way to call it. I think those things are like small efforts towards that, but it's it's challenging. I think if we had a really great established outdoor space that was workplace, that would make it a little bit simpler. I think a lot of our attendance ends up being impacted by like consistency of space. So that's something that we probably need to think through too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think people are just like craving whatever you can get in person, you know? So yeah, I mean, to the extent that like the Stowe House will let you use their space, that's awesome.
I think so too. We could do, and maybe this is like a wordplay, a brainstorm we could have. We could try to do something around Halloween, because it's a time that people really like to already get into character and things like that.
That'd be fun. I wonder too, because it's partway between Wordplay and Music Resource Center, closer to Music Resource Center, if we did like a little, you know, like improv jam, something with some other kids, and maybe get some of our kids out there to read their pieces and or something, however they might work together.
That's a great idea. Maybe we could finish up Scriptober that way.
Oh,
and
fun.
like any students who wrote for Scriptober could meet with MRC. That'd be fun. Let me make a note about that. Ooh, the validation and understanding, I think that's something that like a lot of our teaching artists, just based on their personalities, they just do that naturally. They're like these like nourishing people who are like I see you, I hear your experience, this is rough. And I notice that because we're having the same experiences as adults, sometimes it's hard for us. And I notice like there's a couple of teaching artists in particular who it can be difficult. I see them trying their best and they don't ever put their stuff on the kids, but it's like also just keeping the realism that like whatever the kids are experiencing, definitely so are the adults, and definitely so are the parents. Like when our teaching artists are parents too. And so that's something we've been trying to think through too, is like, how do we support the mental health of our teaching artists too? Yeah. And then keeping all of this within our scope of work, like what's appropriate for us.
Yeah, but even what you're describing of like your teaching artist, like thumbs up, thumbs down, like how are you today, right? Just that moment of like checking in, like reality check, life is hard, let's acknowledge it, you know? But I think things just to keep in mind too, and again, I hear what you're saying, like we're all going through this and it's so hard for everybody. Adolescents like feel things more intensely than we do as adults, the good and the bad, which is really cool in some ways because it means, like I was reading this New York Times article that was written by a psychologist for teens about like how do you take care of yourself, and it was talking about your emotions as a superpower of like you feel things really intensely, whatever you do that's fun right now to like help yourself, that's going to be this like intense boost that it won't be for your parents because you feel that really strongly. But then the flip side is like you're having a rough day and you feel lonely and isolated, and that's really, really hard in a way that it isn't for us as adults, right? And then for adolescents, just that peer stuff is so huge, and to lose that is just, it's hard. And I think that's some of that stuff that we just have to kind of like remind ourselves about sometimes as adults when we're talking to young people.